Welcome. In this video, we're going to look at how to describe the seasonal pattern in a time series plot. So at this stage where you are in your report is you're in the analysis phase, and you would have probably already described the trend plus any other really obvious features as well. And so now we move to the seasonal pattern. So on Insight, you can get to the seasonal graphs by clicking seasonal. Surprise, surprise. This one we're going to be looking at arrivals to New Zealand for working purposes. Okay, and so if we go, we'll just find out a little bit about the variable. It's different to the one that's in the workbook we're using this year. So if you're watching this, what you should be doing is then applying what we do here to a couple of different contexts. Really important that you've thought about some different situations, because in your assessment, if you copy and paste something and it doesn't make sense for the context you're doing, then you risk getting not achieved. Okay, so you've got to be able to practice applying this to different contexts. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, so the one we're looking at a bit of detail about it, it says it's permanent and the long-term arrivals, and this is just to New Zealand, and it's monthly. Permanent and long-term arrivals are people arriving for a stay of 12 months or more, including New Zealanders returning after an absence of 12 months or more. Okay, and that's the part that relates to us. So the first thing we would do is we would have already described the trend. And when we get into describing the seasonal pattern, we should look again for a start at the original data to actually see, for example, is there even a seasonal pattern? Okay, so it's really important. And it's a general principle in statistics. When you're describing a display, start with the big picture before you zoom into detail. Otherwise, you can kind of miss the point. Okay? Always start with the big picture. So we're going to use some prompts just because we're new to this. So we're going to use a writing frame called ODCAR, which stands for Observe, Detail, Context, Assumptions, and Relate. And if you look on the left, it says, first look at the original series. Is there a seasonal effect? If so, how clear is it? Is it very consistent from year to year? Then we get into the specifics of it, the detail, when the peaks and troughs occur, etc. And then we try and make sense of it. So looking at this series, starting with the original series, is there a seasonal effect? So I want you to pause the video and I want you to focus on what do you see when it comes to the seasonal pattern. Hit play when you're ready. So I'm going to write down what I notice, okay? So I notice that there is a clear seasonal pattern from early 2010 onward. Before that, let's see what notice before that. Before that, well, there might be a seasonal pattern, but it's certainly not as clear. Okay, and we would have already talked about how there's a change in the trend, isn't there, around the same time. So something must have happened to completely change the patterns in arrivals for working purposes to New Zealand around the start of 2010. Which is something we'll be looking into later. So I notice there is a clear seasonal effect from early 2010 onwards. Before that, the seasonal pattern looks to have been different and far less clear. Now, we could focus on that later, but we're not as much interested in what happened before 2010. Because the main purpose of this report is about predicting the future. And what's most likely to predict the future well? The data from before 2010 or the more recent data? Well, it's going to be the more recent pattern, isn't it? So we're going to focus on that because that relates more closely to the purpose of our report. So let's look at it. When are the peaks? When are the troughs? And so this is where we look at the seasonal displays, and you can get them by, if you're using Insight, by just changing from standard to seasonal. Okay, so the graph on the left, what that is it's, notice the scale on the vertical axis is pretty much the same as the one on the original series. And that's because it's got the same units. The units here are what? The number of people arriving to New Zealand for permanent or long-term situations involving work. So they're here for working. And we can see the scale there. And what they've done here is that graph on the left, the seasonal plot, is basically just formed by snipping out each year. I don't know if you heard that noise. That was actually my cat trying to play the piano. Okay, yeah. What they've done is they've snipped out each year. So you imagine if you snipped out, say, 2010. Okay, so that'd be from here and to about here. And then they've done that for each year. They've snipped out each year, and then they've stacked them up on top of each other, which is why we see, notice how the earlier years are lower and the later years are higher. And that's because of the fact that there's been a long-term upward trend. Okay, so when we look at the seasonal plot, we want to look for how consistent the seasonal pattern is. And you can see that where the lines are kind of parallel, that means there's consistency. And you can see that in September, in most years, it's jumped up. In fact, in every single year in September, it's jumped up. So that's a clear, consistent seasonal peak. Okay, and then if we go across to the additive seasonal effects graph, that has a different scale, right? Notice how it's got 0 where the dotted line is. Then it goes negatives and then it goes positives. So what that scale is it's the average distance from the trend line. So positives mean above the trend line, negatives mean below the trend line. And so if you look at September, the fact that it's just over 600, that's saying that on average, there are 600 more people arriving to New Zealand for working purposes than the trend. Now the trend is that red line on the original graph. And so that 600 is basically found by averaging these distances above the trend line every September. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the gist of how it works. Okay, so what do we write? Let's write down what we notice. So specifically, there is a seasonal peak every September where the number of people coming to New Zealand on a permanent or long-term basis for work rises to, on average, $600 arrivals above the trend line. Now, I'm just using the word arrivals because that's the units here, right? If you were doing a different context, like ice cream sold, it would be 600 ice creams sold above the trend line. Okay? So specifically, there's a seasonal peak every September where the number of people coming to New Zealand on a permanent or long-term basis for work rises to, on average, 600 arrivals above the trend line. And I just being a bit more specific, whoops, my graph's kind of disappeared. Go back to Insight. Being a bit more specific, we see it's over 600, isn't it? Just over 600. So I should say, to an average, just over 600. Okay, what happens in the trough? Well, there's a trough in December, isn't it? So let's have a look at how far that gets below the trend line. So it says negative 500, right? Well, it's about negative 500. So what does negative 500 mean? Well, it means that there's a seasonal trough every December where the number of people coming to New Zealand on a permanent or long-term basis for work drops to, on average, 500 arrivals below the trend line. Because the negative 500 means 500 below the trend line. Okay, so we've said whether there's a seasonal effect and how clear it is. We've talked about where the main peak and trough are. And then, is there anything else of note when we look at the average seasonal effect? And you want to be looking for consistency here too. Because what I mean by consistency is, notice how the thing about the peak in September and the trough in December is both of them are happening every year. So if you look at the actual years stacked up on the left here, you can see that it rises every single year in September. There's no year where it doesn't. Rises by less some years than others, definitely, and we'll talk about that later. And if we go to December, notice again it drops every single year in December. There's no exceptions. Okay, the average graph on the right won't take consistency into account. All it's doing is it's basically finding the average. So we've got to look at the one on the left to see how consistent that is. So if you look, for example, at this wee mini peak here, that's not always consistent. That's in June. And if you look at the Junes, see how in some years it's less clear than others. And you can see that the lines are less of them are, they're less close to being parallel. Like here it dropped in that year, whenever that was. It's like about 2007. So there's not necessarily been a consistent rise there every year. So we're looking at consistent patterns. Here, which month is that? That's March. So if we look at March, how consistent again has that rise been? And it didn't happen in 2016, so it's not really been a consistent pattern. So here we're just focusing initially on the consistent patterns. We don't want to get too lost in detail. We want to keep our minds on the big picture, which is actually forecasting, isn't it? Okay? All right, so context. That's probably all I need to say about the peaks and the troughs. Context. Okay, the peak that occurs every September is consistent and clear. This could be because, this could be happening because, and then we need to think about it. Okay, why might the number of arrivals to New Zealand for working purposes peak every September? Now, I can't think of an answer to that straight off, so I'm going to do some research. So a good place to start when we're dealing with this sort of data about New Zealand population, is where it actually was collected from, which is, collected by, which is the Statistics New Zealand website. And so searching that, and we find, here it is here, stats.govt.nz. And we're just going to follow our nose a wee bit. We want to think about what are the key words. So any articles that are written about long-term arrival, permanent arrivals to New Zealand for working purposes. So what should we look at first? So I'm going to look at population, because that's to do with New Zealand's population, because it's long-term, permanent. And so we want to look at any news releases. So if we go to it says filter by information releases, surveys and collections, and I'm going to go to international visitor arrivals, and I'm just again going to follow my nose. So see what they're saying about it. So you can do this too. Why don't you go to the same website and have a wee browse? You'll get faster at finding things on here that are relevant with practice. And actually, I've decided I want to find out what they're saying about it. I want to see some commentary on it. Because the people that write the commentary on this, like the reports, will be looking at reasons for the features such as this seasonal peak. So I'm gonna deselect these two, and I'm just gonna select news and reports. So let's see what we can find. we don't seem to have September. We'll look at December because that's where the seasonal trough is. So let's have a look at that. And we'll click on international visit arrivals. And this is going to be mainly tables, whereas we want descriptions. So we'll look at the other links here. Let's have a look at international travel and migration articles. So sections on this page, visitor arrivals. Oh no, permanent and long-term migration is what we want. The other thing to look at is if we look down at migration, because actually we're more looking at, because we're looking at permanent and long-term arrivals, we're not really after visitors actually, are we? We're after migration figures. So let's see if there's anything on that. So international travel and migration, we'll click on that one. And let's see what we can find. So one important question to think about is where they're coming from. And so I found this article here that talks about annual net migration remains high in October. That was just from clicking international travel and migration. And it has this wee graphic. And it's from the year ended October 2017, so it's recent data, which is important. And you can see, if you just pause the video and have a look at this, there was the total net migration, which means going in and coming out to New Zealand for that 12-month period. And what we're interested in for the purposes of this report is the arrivals, because permanent long-term arrivals, and we can see that most of them were from non-New Zealand citizens. So nearly 100,000 arrivals that year from non-New Zealand citizens compared to only just over 30,000 from New Zealand citizens. So roughly 3 times the number from were from 3 times the number that were returning New Zealand citizens were actually from people that were not New Zealand citizens. So in terms of understanding the times of the years that they're peaking, that's probably an important factor to consider, isn't it? So I'm just going to write that down, because what we're really doing is we're just sort of following our nose. So context, the peak that occurs every September. So I don't know what it is because of yet. So I would actually write something like, I was not sure why this would be the case. So I searched for more information on the topic in the Statistics New Zealand website. In an article titled Annual Net Migration Remains High in October, published 22 November 2017. And I'll put in the hyperlink to it. I found that, and rather than just copying and pasting, I'm just going to summarize it, okay, which is an important skill. So the key thing was that, and I'm going to put these figures down. So there were 99,500 arrivals from non-New Zealand citizens. So most of the permanent and long-term arrivals from that 12-month period were from non-New Zealand citizens, and 99,500 compared to only 32,100 New Zealand citizens. Returning New Zealand citizens. So why might the non-New Zealand citizens be more likely to arrive in September and less likely to arrive in December? So one possibility that occurred to me, and I'd need to check this, is that perhaps people from the Northern Hemisphere, their summertime is June, July, and so their if it was education, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Because they'd be starting a new year around then. But we're talking about people for working purposes. So I'm not sure. I'm going to have to find out more information. So another place to look also is the stuff.co.nz website, which has news articles from different sources of news in New Zealand. And I just typed in a search for migration sources and then scrolled down. And I just basically checked out quite a few of these. And one that seemed to be useful was this one here from October 2015, which is still reasonably recent. And scrolling down, I found near the bottom here, it said a bunch of stuff about countries that people are coming from when they migrate to New Zealand, which I knew was what I was looking for. And it says here the largest overall contributors to migration and were from India and China, while New Zealand had a net 4,700 increase from Philippines and etc., etc. But the key thing is those numbers are much higher from India and China, aren't they? Much higher, and that would be unlikely to be a one-off. So I'm going to write that down. So I wondered which countries contributed the most to this. An article from October 2015 claim on stuff.co.nz by Hamish Rutherford stated that China and India contributed by far the most of any individual countries to migration. And so I need to get some numbers to back that up. So I'm just going to put in the numbers from the article, which was 12,900 from India and 8,500 from China. And that was for the year ending October 2015, I think. No, the year to September 30. I found another article on stuff.co.nz, and this was also from 2015, and this says that it seems to suggest that a lot of the migrants to New Zealand are actually on student working visas. So, in other words, they're just coming for a couple of years and generally will be doing sort of labour type jobs. So, tertiary institutions have seen a rise in Indian and Chinese students on the back of exceptionally strong migration figures. And then reading further down, It says the figure was boosted by students from India and China and more migrants from Australia, mostly returning New Zealanders. It says after Australia, the next biggest group of migrants, so obviously Australia also had a lot of people migrating to New Zealand as well. The next biggest group of migrants was 13,800 from India, with 3/4 on student visas. Well, though of course the data we're looking at is people here to work. It says almost as many were from the United Kingdom, mostly on work visas or with New Zealand citizenship, followed by 10,400 from China, with about half on student visas. So the peak in September, the only thing I can make out from that is it appears to be to do with the fact that if you were going to do something new and you're from the Northern Hemisphere, that would be just after their sort of summer break, wouldn't it? And so it would maybe be a logical time to go on a long-term, to actually migrate or to move somewhere for a few years. So I'm going to write down the United Kingdom also contributed a large number. So this led me to believe that the annual peak in arrivals for working purposes in September could coincide with the end of the summer holidays in the Northern Hemisphere for those who are studying. Perhaps working contracts also often end around that time, or just before. And I say perhaps because we don't know. We know in the Southern Hemisphere that would be the case for our summer, but our summer also happens to be the turn of the new year, doesn't it? So I'm speculating here. So this led me to believe the annual peak may be because of those reasons, meaning that people, younger travellers on working visas, may be more likely to come to New Zealand at that time of year. And I'm thinking here particularly places like China, India, and the UK. I'm gonna say I'm not actually sure why there's a seasonal trough in December, because there's nothing particularly about December that would make you think there'd be less people coming here then. The only thing maybe is that people want to be around their loved ones or maybe back in their home countries for Christmas, which would only affect really the countries that celebrate Christmas, so the Western sort of countries. So I don't really know. So I'm still not sure why the least common time of year for arrivals to New Zealand for working purposes was December. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that those who celebrate Christmas want to stay at home with their extended families for that period rather than travel. Okay, and that's about all I can really think of to say on that. Remember, even at excellence level, you don't have to have answers to everything. Sometimes the better thing is to admit what you can't find, and sometimes it will come to light later. And if it does come to light later, if I found a clear reason for this later on, I wouldn't go back and change this, because my report needs to be a record of my journey of discovery as I've got puzzled and then found out more about this context. Now, I've already related it to research. Assumptions around this. Can you think of any assumptions that we might have made? One thing to keep in mind is that this data has come from people reporting or filling in their forms when they fly into New Zealand. So their expressed intention is to be here for work purposes for a long period of time. A stay of 12 months or more. But then they may not actually end up necessarily all staying for as long as they thought. So that's just something to keep in mind. Although it doesn't really affect my description on the seasonal pattern. So I'm probably going to leave that, and I probably would have actually talked about that. We'll talk about that when I get into my forecasting. So just kind of sticking to the point. Okay, the other key thing. So I'm just going to leave the assumptions and relate bit for now because I've kind of already dealt with relate and I can't think of any more relevant assumptions. What I'm going to focus on now is changes in the seasonal effect, and this is really important. When you look at this data here, notice how it's fanning out. And so what we're seeing particularly is that the seasonal peaks are getting bigger and bigger. Now, the average seasonal effect that Insight uses doesn't really take that fully into account. It takes an average of the seasonal effects. So, getting just a little bit technical for a sec, a thing to bear in mind, particularly when you're thinking about how the average seasonal effect is formed, is the way it's done. And it says here, this is how Insight does it. It says, basically, the method used is to first smooth the trend and cycle, that means the seasonal pattern, using a lowest smoother, that means fitting basically a line or curve of best fit to a window of points. And what it does is it says the regression that is used, that's the model that is used, is weighted, and that the observations near the edge of the window are given less weight than observations near the centre of the window when determining the local regression line. In other words, it gives greater weighting to the data near the middle of the series. So when we look at this, see how near the centre of the series the seasonal fluctuations are less extreme than they are in the more recent data. But actually it's the more recent data that has more relevance to our forecasting. And so we need to think about that. Now we can also possibly see it here if we look at the most recent data. Well, this is 2016, and notice how the trend, see, that usually goes through about August. So let's find August. So that's here. So this difference here from the trend line up to the seasonal peak is from just over 3,000 to 5,000. So that's a lot more than the 600 average seasonal rise, isn't it? In other words, in recent years it's been rising further above the trend than the average seasonal effect has it. So when it makes forecasts, it's going to base these on the average seasonal effect. So what might be an issue there? What's it going to do? Well, it's basically going to do this. So it's predicted seasonal fluctuations and not going to be as great as what actually has been happening recently. Okay, so let's write that down. So what I observe, I notice that the degree of seasonal variation has been increasing. All right? Specifically, the peaks are getting further and further above the trend line over the last how many years? Well, since 2011. So specifically, the September peaks and arrivals for working purposes have been rising further and further above the trend line over the last 6 or 7 years, since 2011. Okay, giving some more detail. In 2011, the September figure, and let's have a look. It was only about roughly, let's have a look. The trend at that time was probably about 1,700, and the actual figure was, so this is September 2011. If I go back to the data, I can actually find out what the figure was. So September, and I'm looking at work, was 2,621. So 2,621 compared to about 1,700. So that's about 921 above the trend line. So in September it was about 920 arrivals higher than the trend line, whereas in 2016 we see, let's have a look. So in September 2016, the actual figure was 4,970, but the trend at 2016's peak, if we look at that, so it's about here, wasn't it? Looking straight down, so if we go across from there, it's probably about 3,700 or 3,800, somewhere around there. We'll call it looks more closer to 3,800, doesn't it? So 1,170 above the trend line. And we can see in between it's sort of risen to that point, isn't it? So this represents the increase that we're seeing. And then when you look at the average seasonal effect, it's only just over 600, which is even less than that, than the one from 2011. Why might that be? So why might the average one be less than this one in here? Well, it'll be because it's taking also into account this sort of scrambled seasonal effect before that. So what all this means is that when we go to make our predictions, the average seasonal effect that it's using is probably going to do what? Well, it's almost certainly going to underestimate the seasonal rise in September, isn't it? So we need to keep that in mind, and we need to write that down. It's really important. If you want to be getting more than achieved, you need to be thinking about the implications for this sort of thing too when we make predictions. So, context. Well, before I do that, I'm going to say the average seasonal effect used by software only has a roughly 600 arrivals spike in September's, which is clearly is likely to be much less than what happens, or than the actual rise we get over the next few years. So later when we forecast, we need to remember this, or remember that our forecasts for September, for the next 2 Septembers, are therefore likely to be too low. So making that link. Okay, context. So we need to find out why the seasonal fluctuations might be increasing. So the increasing seasonal fluctuations, notably the increasing rises in September, increasing peaks in September's, could, well, seem interesting. So I am going to try to find out what factors could be driving this. So we need to do some more research. Now, this video has been long enough, so I'm going to leave that to you. And if you can't find anything, it is okay to admit that, and you still can get excellence. The worst thing you can do is grasp at straws and try and come up with a sketchy reason as to why that's happening, and say it confidently, because that's more likely to stop you getting excellence. So only bring in a reason if you can clearly find one. Do write down any keep a record of the research that you've done, because that will help. Remember, this is meant to be a journal of your discovery as you try and make sense of this time series. Quick recap though, when you're describing seasonality, start by looking at the original graph, not the seasonal graph. Talk about whether there's seasonality and how clear it is. Then talk about when the peaks and troughs are, give numbers to back it up. Then relate it to the context, try and make sense of what might be driving these peaks and troughs. Then look at how constant the seasonal pattern is. Has it been increasing? Has it been staying about the same? See you later.